Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And I guess today I am talking about the new album from Calvin Harris, Funk Wave Bounces Volume 2. Man, it's been a long time since I've talked about Calvin Harris. A long time ago, I reviewed every single one of this guy's studio albums, and you can find the link to my playlist of all the videos I've done on him in the description. Though, if you wanted a recap, I have a very complicated relationship with Calvin Harris. Do I like him, or do I dislike him? Yes. The guy does always get lumped in with the likes of artists like David Guetta. Like that guy, he's perhaps not quite as much of a mainstream presence as he was 10 years ago, but he was at one point the biggest name in all of electronic music in terms of sheer chart presence. Well known for a certain brand of bargain barrel lowest common denominator radio pop EDM. Unlike David Guetta, his catalog isn't overwhelmingly dog shit. Compared to Guetta, who's made like 10 good songs over his decades-long career, Calvin Harris can be counted on to at least have one good track for every 2 or 3 duds. He's got a lot of variety in his sound, and a surprising amount of great one-off individual tracks. And back when I still did the Todd Ripoff videos counting down my favorite hit songs of a given year, he would consistently show up on pretty much every one. Special shoutouts to My Way and One Kiss, which respectively topped and nearly topped the 2016 and 2018 lists. Still love both of those. And I do also have to give special credit to his more recent work from the last couple of years that he did under the name Love Regenerator, where he focused entirely on retro 90s underground techno and acid house formulas. All that stuff was really cool. Sure, not everything he made under that name was a winner, but there's definitely more hits than misses. I could keep at least 8 different tracks from that little side project. I do think this guy does have passion and talent for making dance music. It's just that his full albums mostly suck. I do think his sophomore album, Ready for the Weekend, is the sole exception. That one's all around fairly solid and even features a decent handful of individual cuts I think are great. But all of the other albums range from mediocre to terrible, with maybe 1 or 2 tracks I like on each one and otherwise full to the brim with duds. I wouldn't score any of the others higher than the 5 range at this point. 18 Months may have had every single one of its singles become a smash hit and is a big nostalgia button for lots of people thanks to how inescapable all of it was on the radio back then, but I find the whole thing to be a total flavorless snooze fest. Motion was a complete trash fire that tried really hard to follow the big room house trend at the time to a frankly embarrassing degree, and I got very little blowback for completely shitting on it in my video. Even his debut in 2007, I Created Disco, is a corny and shallow LCD sound system ripoff that delivers somewhat decent blown out 80s inspired electro grooves, but features his own insufferable singing with all these shit lyrics about how many girls he gets in an attempt at ironic humor that falls flat and instead comes off just punchably smug and self-satisfied in that LMFAO I'm sexy and I know it kind of way. I mean, to be fair, that album does have a lot more defenders, people who just find it to be a lot of brainless fun and maybe some who do find his attempts at humor to actually land, but I personally stand by my opinion that that album sucks just as much as his supposed sellout work. And then there was his actual last album from 2017, Funk Wave Bounces Volume 1. That was an album I for once had been somewhat excited to jump into off the promise of its excellent lead single, Slide, with Frank Ocean and Migos. A turn for more of a laid-back retro disco kind of sound that somehow got its guest features out of the hip-hop world to feel like they fit really well. That track still absolutely holds up, and the album certainly got favorable reviews at the time, but for me, it was a real letdown since pretty much every track was just a rote copy-paste of Slide with different guest features. And even if there were technically more highlights than there are on his other albums, to the point where I would have marked it as his second strongest album, maybe could have gone over better as like a 5-track EP, as a full album, it was so ridiculously samey and beat its initially really unique sound so far into the ground that he somehow got this 37-minute, 10-track experience to feel tedious and overlong. And listening to it in full just once soured me on even the better tracks and the other singles I liked on there. Slide remains the only track on there I've actually kept around on my iPod to this day. I remember thinking after that album, man, you do not need to fulfill that promise of a sequel in the title. I don't know if I'm game for an entire second album of more stuff that sounds exactly like this. Granted, that was 5 entire years ago. We're way past this album's original hype cycle, and a lot has changed in the world since 2017. We're in a totally different era where I don't make videos about the pop charts at all anymore, and retro 90s house is more trendy than retro disco. It honestly seems kinda weird that we're getting this album now. It feels a little behind the times, like maybe the kind of thing that may have been meant to drop around 2020 before COVID hit. At least if not for the inclusion of some names who broke out afterwards, like Lil Durk and Coi Leray. But it still stinks of the kind of thing that he's only putting out because he promised the public he would. On the other hand, the timing of this album means my disappointment in the first volume isn't nearly as fresh. If he'd come out with this back in, say, 2019 or something, I probably would have been even less in the mood for it. I still wasn't exactly going into this with soaring expectations. I still had that leftover feeling that I would have been happier if he had just stuck to singles and never released another full-on album again. But I was still just curious enough to give this a shot. If nothing else, it's something for the ad revenue. Let's just see how it fares. And as it turns out, it's fine. It's less samey than the first volume was, despite picking up from pretty much the exact same place that one left off from. Still a mixed bag at best that I don't really feel strongly about one way or the other, and definitely falls off in its closing stretch. But it's got its moments here and there. I don't mind it too much. I like it more than Volume 1. While there is no track on here that comes even close to hitting the same heights as Slide did, this album has the benefit of ever so slightly growing on me the more I heard it, compared to its predecessor initially being decent and then getting severely diminishing returns with every revisit. Like, going through individual tracks, after a pleasant enough little intro that isn't connected to anything, we start with New Money with 21 Savage, which I suppose isn't the absolute strongest or most indicative of starting points you could have gone with, but I guess isn't the worst either. Like, 21 Savage doesn't sound like the kind of artist who would make any sense going over this kind of vibey funk instrumental, but his typically detached delivery ends up fitting better than I would have thought, and his half-mumbled hook wasn't not catchy. I don't have much to say about the likes of Potion or Woman of the Year, but I do quite like both, and they ended up being highlights. The former would have probably also been my pick for the lead single off this thing, even though there's absolutely nothing surprising about it. It really just resonated with me off the promise of Dua Lipa's hook and not much else. Even if sprinkle with a little bit of sex is not a great line, I just tuned it out. I stopped caring about it after the first time I heard it. Also, Young Thug is on it. He doesn't elevate the track or deliver much of any of his usual personality, but he doesn't get in the way either, like he kinda did on Heatstroke. And for Woman of the Year, and I don't know, I guess Stefflon Don, Chloe, and Coi Leray have some passable chemistry together, and the track sounds nice. Don't really have anything to note about it, but I like it. I would totally get it if any of these tracks so far were forgettable duds for you, but I enjoy them enough while they're on. Obsessed is also fine. I do quite like the piano chord progression underscoring the entire thing. Do tend to enjoy Calvin Harris's typical approach to piano chords like these more often than not. Although it can absolutely get a bit repetitive, and neither Charlie Puth nor Shensi really left much of an impression with their performances. But from there we get a handful of tracks that stuck out to me a fair bit more. New to You is one of a very small number of tracks on here that mostly wins thanks to Calvin Harris's instrumental and isn't living or dying on the guest features. I mean, not to take away from the appearances of Tinashe, Normani, or even Offset, who all do quite well in their own right, but the real star of the show on that track is the full live string orchestra Harris brought in for this track, which sounds particularly lush and gorgeous. I guess if I had to point to one individual track on this thing which stood out as the strongest, it'd probably be this one. Ready or Not features a welcome presence from Busta Rhymes. Even though he's saying absolutely nothing of substance, he's just fun to have around, and his energy is pretty infectious. He's probably the single most fun presence of any guest feature on the album. Though next we got Stay With Me, which is also a highlight for me, but I have a lot of mixed thoughts on. On one hand, the instrumental is great, a fair bit more up-tempo and energetic than everything else here, bringing back the string orchestra going over this really nice, crisp, and danceable new disco beat. On the other hand, the guest features on this track are a mixed bag. I mean, Pharrell's chorus sounds great, and his voice is really smooth over this instrumental, but Halsey's detached and almost Valley Girl-like rapping sounds pretty corny, and Justin Timberlake's entire pre-chorus is just... no. Maybe it's just me being an ace guy who's never once been able to relate to the sentiment, damn, look at those pants. And I guess Halsey joining him on the ad-libs as if they're simultaneously admiring the same woman is kind of funny. But, oh boy, is Timberlake's corny white guy energy a bit much here. And this is coming from someone who actually liked Can't Stop the Feeling. On the other hand, the way this track pays off into Stay With Me Part 2 is excellent. Part 2 is basically just an extended outro that kind of requires the build-up of the main track to hit the best, but that key change and all those different melodic progressions are way more satisfying than what was leading up to it, and both Halsey and Timberlake sound markedly better there than they did on the main track. Really, these two parts should have just been combined into the same track. If I have to treat them as the same whole, both sections would have been much better off for it, and I'm fully willing to put up with Timberlake's corniness with the knowledge that it's eventually going to pay off that way. If I have to judge the two parts separately, Part 2 is definitely more of a highlight than Part 1, but I suppose I can mark both as favorites. The bad news is that this is the last track on the album I found to be particularly worth anything. Everything afterwards is all skips. Somebody else with Georgia Smith and Lil Durk, I guess, has some neat guitar soloing, but there's a noticeable drop in energy here coming off of Stay With Me that consistently makes me start to lose interest. Nothing more to say with Black and Doneo is almost saved by the latter's appearance in the last minute or so, but is otherwise really dull and lives up to its title. Live My Best Life with Snoop Dogg and Lotto is just a corny, lumbering dud all around, and Snoop's appearance in particular is the worst feature on the whole album. His mumbling about titties is more creepy than anything. Lean On Me with Sway Lee exists, and then we got the closer, Day One with Pharrell and Pusha T. I mean, I like Pusha T's feature, but that's about all I like about this track. The instrumental is notable only for its overbearing, blubbering bass, which seems maybe somewhat inspired by Herbie Hancock's Chameleon, but a far cry from working nearly as well. And Pharrell, despite having just killed it on Stay With Me, for whatever reason turned to complete dog shit on this track. His performance sounds way more yelpy, forced, and awkward here, and his parts are particularly tough to get through. Yeah, this album fell off really hard in this last 5-track stretch. But that's everything on Funkwave Bounces Volume 2. It's alright. It has good tracks on it and bad tracks on it. I wouldn't be surprised if most people find this to be pretty underwhelming in comparison to the album it's a sequel to. That album did see a lot more enthusiasm at the time, and this one appears to have mostly been met with shrugs. Still, Volume 1 is an album that, while I thought was pretty decent at first, got worse and worse the more I heard it. And this album got roughly the same amount of enjoyment every time I heard it. Maybe even slightly grew on me, if not by a lot. Maybe that's just because this album's slightly more laid back and vibe-centric, and thus that slight bit better a fit for my personal taste. Though, I don't know, it's not like there's a night and day difference, and this sequel is markedly less funky than its predecessor. Still, I feel like I'd be more willing to put up with Damn Look at Those Pants than I would be for Young Thug yelping about lemonade, Lil Yachty reminiscing about pizza, Dram having to name drop his only hit and accidentally signal the end of his popular career, or Feels forever ruining the word feels for me and continuing to haunt my dreams against my will every couple of months. And those were the better tracks on Volume 1. Obviously, this project is not going to be sticking around with me in its full entirety. I already knew that would happen since I don't keep around any of his other albums in full. But there's a non-zero chance I keep around some of the better tracks here, like Potion, or New to You, or Ready or Not, or even Stay With Me. The parts I like in that track still outweigh the parts I don't. At the very least, this album was not a disappointment. I went in expecting front-to-back forgettable mediocrity, and at least gave me some parts I liked without annoying me that much elsewhere. It definitively does not completely suck. Is the album worth going out of your way for? No. And you probably won't have to worry about it following you around, since it appears to be tanking pretty hard in comparison with the first one in terms of chart success. But it's really not that bad either. I can even award it with the title of New Second Best Calvin Harris Album and a generous rating of a 6.3 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.